Okay, Belgium's Heart of Darkness. We talked before about King Leopold II of Belgium. We talked about how his claim to the Congo was one of the earliest claims to a large part of Africa by European powers. And it set off what's become called the scramble for Africa. So after after Leopold's attempt to take the Congo, other countries rushed to try to claim their own colonies in Africa. Remember, he hired Stanley to go in and make treaties with the people after, Stanley had gone in and found Leopold. And that's sort of the last thing we talked about. But here we see the horrors that took place under Leopold's ownership of the Congo. This is by Tim Stanley. It was published in October 2012 in History Today. I don't know if Tim Stanley is any relation to the Stanley that we read about in our earlier reading, but maybe. And the caption here, King Leopold II's personal rule of the vast Congo Free State anticipated the horrors of the 20th century, argues Tim Stanley. Now, when we say it anticipated the horrors of the 20th century, we're talking about what Hitler did, what Mussolini and Stalin did. We're talking about the Holocaust, okay? We're saying that what Leopold did 100 years earlier kind of set the stage for what was going to happen in Europe in the 1930s, 1940s. When I was a boy, we played a card game called Name 5 Famous Belgians. The game speaks to a lazy stereotype that Belgium is a country with no history, lost between France and Germany. It was crazy to learn that one of this small country's kings was one of history's greatest mass murderers. Leopold II, 1835 to 1909, wanted Belgium to join the club of European empires, but the government wouldn't pay for the expensive scramble for Africa. They gave the job to Leopold, who used personal favors to convince other European countries to give him control of the Congo River. He promised to bring civilization to the so-called Dark Continent. Our first question here is, who is King Leopold II? Obviously, Leopold was the King of Belgium, and he was the owner of the Congo. Named the Congo Free State in 1885, Leopold's playground was a 76 times the size of Belgium. Mostly made up of unmapped jungle, it was at first a huge expense. When worldwide demand for rubber went up, Leopold cashed in. Sorry, someone messaged me in the chat. Congolese workers were sent into the jungle to slash down vines and layer their bodies with rubber latex. Later, they would scrape it off their skin, often taking flesh and hair with it. The work was hard and it harmed the workers. The only cheap way to collect rubber was via the forced work of Congolese society. The Congo Free State evolved from a vanity possession into a slave plantation. So just to make this clear, what would happen would be the worker was sent out into the fields, the rubber fields, or into the jungle where rubber trees grow, and they would cut the rubber tree or slash the vine, depending on kind of how large it gets, and then they would let the sap run onto their skin, and they would layer it on like they were soaping up in the shower, and it would dry there. Okay, that is what rubber is. It's sap from a latex tree. It's literally a tree. You can look this up. And then they would sort of walk back to camp where someone's job would be to scrape the rubber off of their skin. And that's how they collected it. It was horrible and incredibly painful. And the word rubber, it speaks to rubbing this stuff off of someone's skin. That's where the idea comes from. So our questions here is, how big was the Belgian Congo compared to Belgium? Well, it says here at the top, it was 76 times. I have a typo here. It was 76 times the size of Belgium. It was 76 times the size of Belgium. And the people who gathered the rubber were the Congolese workers. Okay? And it was horrible. The reading goes on. Leopold's hell operated by an insane logic. Villagers were expected to gather a certain amount of rubber, and the police were sent in to collect it. This was sped up by looting, setting fire to homes, and rape of Congolese people. If a village failed to reach its quota, hostages would be taken and shot. To make sure the police weren't wasting their bullets, they were told to collect the severed hands of their victims. After this, a business arose where severed hands were used to by the police to earn their pay. Okay, so a business in severed hands developed among the villagers and the police that couldn't reach their quotas. So it went from forcing people to do things to proving that you had forced people to do things to just torturing people. So what would happen if a village didn't produce enough rubber? Bad things. Okay, they would loot or burn homes. They would kill people. They would rape. And then if that still didn't work, they would send people into the neighborhood to collect people's hands, literally, with a machete. The most famous story of Leopold's Congo is Joseph Conrad's novel, Heart of Darkness, published in 1899. With its bloody imagery, you might think that Conrad exaggerated the awfulness of the regime. In fact, the cold details of missionary journals make even more horrifying reading. William Henry Shepherd, a Presbyterian missionary, wrote about passing by more than a dozen burned villages. He was taken to the headquarters of a police recruit called Mulumba Nkusa. Leopold had demanded that Mulumba collect 60 slaves and a huge amount of rubber. But only 8 slaves and 2,500 balls of rubber had been gathered. Quote, "I think we killed between 80 and 90 of the local workers," said Mulumba. He took Shepherd to a hut reserved for the rape of hostages and to another full of collected hands that were being dried out. Shepherd counted 81 hands hanging over the fire. So we can see that this was the real deal. This is according to a missionary journal. This guy had no reason to lie. Okay. The question here is, what is the book Heart of Darkness? It's a book by Joseph Conrad that talks about the horrors of the Congo. But even that book, the horrors that it talks about, was still kind of treating it nicely. Even Conrad didn't capture how horrible all of this was. The Congolese horror ended after international outrage forced the Belgian country to take control of the colony in 1908. So Belgium itself took the colony back from Leopold, their king. Estimates for the number of people killed range between 2 and 15 million, easily putting Leopold in the top 10 of history's mass murderers, next to Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini. When Leopold died in 1909, the king's funeral procession was booed. So our question here is, how many Congolese people died because of King Leopold II of Belgium? And the answer is between 2 and 15 million. It's interesting that even in elementary school and middle school, we've heard of World War II, we've heard of Adolf Hitler, we've heard of the Holocaust, and yet many adults that you might meet around aren't aware that Leopold II was doing a lot of this stuff 100 years before that in Africa. It raises the question of why we have not heard about that. Okay, so that's it for the Belgium's Heart of Darkness article. Hopefully that helps us understand the immense human cost of imperialism, which is the entire point of learning about this.